Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today I'll briefly talk about some of the usual criticisms that are offered about postcolonialism and postcolonial studies. And the danger in these criticisms is that they are not really very well informed and they rely on kind of a faulty logic or misplaced assumptions. And I thought it's important to kind of clarify some of these things so that you can better use postcolonial theory and postcolonial literary scholarship for your work. So, one of the main critiques that I hear often from mostly not very informed sources, but sometimes from scholars, is about postcolonialism being too culturalist, which means that it mostly relies on issues of culture and doesn't necessarily dwell on class and class hierarchies and class conflict. So while most of the major critics could be considered culturalist, it goes without saying that there are postcolonial critics who do use Marxism. Even Gayatri Spivak, right, the so-called post-structuralist, deconstructionist, her major essays that you've read, even Can the Subaltern Speak, rely heavily on a Marxist understanding of class and a Marxist explanation of class and the global division of labor, right? And then if you go beyond that, people like Robert Young, right, who obviously is a Marxist scholar and wrote a monumental book on postcolonialism. Even Said admits part of his Marxist leanings when he refers to Antonio Gramsci, right, in one of his famous interviews, and how he uses some of Gramscian concepts in his writing. So I think that argument that somehow postcolonialism is purely culturalist falls by the wayside. Another argument that's offered kind of from the side is that decolonial studies is actually more revolutionary than postcolonial studies, right? Because postcolonial studies is too institutionalized, too Eurocentric, too much part of the Western academy. But what we need to keep in mind is that postcolonial studies, part of its repertoire is decolonial studies, right? After all, those of us who use Fanon, who use scholars from the non-Western traditions, and we still call ourselves postcolonialists, are doing that. But more importantly, in my opinion, as a scholar of postcolonialism, the most productive place, as Baba teaches us, is not necessarily here on one extreme or there in a nativist hiding place or in a totally Eurocentric view of looking at the world, but rather bringing these strains sometimes in conflict or sometimes face to face so that we can create new thought. And so any kind of purist thought, right or left, then is a threat to that possibility. Another thing that I've often heard from some of my friends even is that postcolonialism wrongly assumes that colonialism is over. I guess they just know the term postcolonialism and assume that that's what it means. But I always point it out to people, find me one scholar of colonialism or postcolonialism who asserts that colonialism in all its forms have ended and we are now in a postcolonial world. No one says that. What we do acknowledge that postcolonialism itself is an imperfect term, And if you have read the early essays that came out, like Ian McClintock, Ella Schwatt, and others, I have lectures on them, you already know that the reason postcolonialism as a term caught on and eventually became a subfield of study was because it was safe. You could use it to create curriculum instead of anti-imperialist discourse and all that. But nowhere did anyone in postcolonial studies ever assume that colonialism was over, even if physical occupation ended, and which has not ended in so many cases, Palestine, Kashmir, and so many other places. Even as physical colonization of spaces ended, there is always, always imperial influence of global powers, which is still evident everywhere in the world. So there is, in my opinion, no scholar of postcolonialism who works with the basic premise that colonialism has ended and we are just going to talk about the end of colonialism. Also keep in mind that postcolonial studies includes within its area of study or topics of study the pre-colonial retrieval of histories, the histories and literatures produced during the colonial phase and then in the post-colonial phase. How have people dealt with it, imagined it, and thought about it? We teach that, we talk about it. Then within those histories, we also distinguish between the dominant national histories of post-colonial nation states and what the subaltern groups have produced. I mean, if you look at the production of subaltern studies group in India, I mean, they have produced about 10 volumes of these texts, right? Now, granted, these texts are retrieved by bourgeois intellectuals, right, by middle-class intellectuals, but at least they are being retrieved, articulated, and represented and published in solidarity with the people, with the subaltern groups. So overall then, beyond this, there are certain naive critiques, right, where anyone who works in the Western Academy is considered somehow a sellout, right, because they have decided not to live in their own home country, right, or in their own native country and have taken up these positions in the Western Academy. Or if Dirlik was the one who wrote a famous essay about it, right? But here is the deal. Not every one of us who works in the Western Academy is co-opted or is a foundational intellectual. I mean, think of it. Pretty much anyone who does post-colonial studies has some radical progressive leanings. And the work that we do is really important in cultural terms. Even if, we are not given full agency, we at least have changed what is offered in English departments. We have changed how literature is read, how it is viewed, how it is talked about, right? And I think that is a great contribution of post-colonial scholars and post-colonial studies as a field. Now, these are some of the things that I think of off the cuff. And then there are certain assumptions about post-colonial studies, not necessarily critiques. And those are, in my view, not very well-informed assumptions. For example, some people think post-colonialism is a monolithic theory. So anytime I hear someone say, I'm going to apply post-colonialism for my dissertation, I want to stop them and say, no, specify which theorist, whose work, Marxist post-colonialism, eco-critical post-colonialism, feminist post-colonialism, right, historicist post-colonialism, because it's not a monolithic field. It's a combination of different strains of philosophy and knowledge that people use for certain specific purposes, and those purposes are to critique power, to critique what happened during the 19th and 20th century colonialism, but not just represent the natives as passive recipients of the colonial aggression, also account for their acts of resistance, semiotic, or material resistance. All of that forms part of postcolonial studies. So let's say if you decide to use postcolonialism or postcolonial theory or attempt to specialize in it, please keep in mind that, yeah, there is a body of literature that you have to be aware of. There are texts, primary and secondary, that you need to read to understand the field, right? In a broader sense. But then what you do with that knowledge, as long as you are challenging the dominant paradigms of the West or within the nation states where you exist, where you live yourself, in one way or the other, you are doing postcolonial studies. And you can use postcolonial theory to write about those things. But do not assume that it's a monolithic body of literature with one message or one way of doing things, right? And before you buy into these thin critiques of postcolonialism being too Eurocentric, being too much committed to theory, or not being Marxist enough, I would encourage you to explore a little more. And I can promise you that you will always find scholars, intellectuals, teachers of postcolonial studies who are all doing different and innovative things. One important thing to keep in mind is that postcolonialism is one of the most hybrid subfields of English studies, and it is shameless in appropriating any knowledge that it can use. We have no qualms about using Marx. We have no qualms about using Sinor, right? We have no problem in mobilizing Gandhi's work. We have no problem in reading Samir Amin, Amartya Sen, anyone. We are not region bound in where we draw from, and we are not discipline bound. We can draw knowledge from economics, we can draw knowledge from sociology, from history, from political science, from political geography, because all of these knowledges we mobilize in one way or the other to argue for the rights of those who may not be part of the dominant groups in the world, who might be on the periphery of whatever constitutes the center, so-called, of power at any given time in the world or at any given time within a national space. These are all the things that we try to do in postcolonial studies. Now, I acknowledge, it's not a perfect field of study, but no field of study is perfect or neatly tucked and, bow-tied. No, it has its loose ends, and I think that's our job as scholars and your job as emerging scholars to tease those things out. But what I'm trying to suggest is that if you have an opinion about postcolonialism, positive or negative, just read carefully so that you can account for where those opinions are coming from, and you have something to back those opinions up. Right? Otherwise, you, me, and everyone else, if we think about postcolonial studies unreflectively, simply after having watched a few videos, chances are we will not have a deeper understanding of the field and its debates and its struggles, right? And we will very easily fall prey to, simplified ways of thinking about it. Let me give you an example. The other day I was watching a leftist panel. Great. These were young, progressive leftists talking about the world and how power works, how U.S. foreign policy works. And there were two scholars or activists who do what is called political psychology, postcolonial psychology. And they asserted that one problem with postcolonial studies is that no one is studying the psychology of colonization. Now, if you and me watch that uncritically, we're like, oh man, this is another flaw in postcolonial studies. But to assert that is preposterous. We have Fanon, we have Octave Menoni, we have works by Césaire on colonialism, right? We have people who have drawn on the works of Freud, right? All of this, what happens to the psyche of the colonized, what happens to the psyche of the colonizer, Albert Memmi's work, right? The colonizer and the colonized. All of these works draw on the knowledge of psychoanalysis and psychology, right? And we always account for the psychological impact of colonial encounter. I mean, think of it. When Spivak talks about worlding of the world, what is she relying on? Cathectation, which comes from psychoanalysis. What is cathectation? Cathectation is when the native, while working with the European masters, internalizes and aligns themselves with the point of view of their masters and comes to see their own land from the perspective of their masters. That act of seeing the world from the perspective of their masters is what Spivak calls the worlding of the world. So I hope these examples clarify a little bit as to why I'm skeptical about some of the critiques of postcolonial studies. Right? I would always, admit that the valid critiques may be about it being too esoteric, it being not very accessible. I absolutely agree with those critiques. But to imagine postcolonialism as a certain thing and then impugn onto it certain failures and weaknesses, I think it is unfair, and it doesn't do justice to those who might be entering the field of postcolonial studies as young scholars. And it can be sometimes disheartening and very misleading. So I hope these few words on this highly complex and contested topic are of some use to you. I do highly recommend that anyone who's interested in postcolonial studies should at least read, Robert Young's big book on postcolonialism or Ania Lumba's book on postcolonialism, because it makes sense of the field of study as it emerges and establishes itself. I have a whole list of webinars on postcolonialism. I think there are about 10 lectures in it. I'll post the link in the description. I highly recommend that you should watch those, and maybe those could be useful to you as well. So that's all from me today. I hope you all are doing well and taking care of each other. Please continue to do so. I hope you're staying safe. I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, from me to you, peace and love.